Well, welcome to the AHSA meeting for April, brought to you via Zoom. Saturday morning a few weeks ago, 3rd of April, our local members had a wonderful site visit to Greg Batson's hangar near Archfield Aerodrome. To see the 4 CAC boomerangs that are under construction there, including Greg's own aircraft, which is almost ready to be taken out to Caboolture, the final assembly, and to do its test flights. Greg's wonderful descriptions of all the things that were going on there was recorded. He was wearing a microphone that Peter had fixed him up with, and that was recorded, and his commentary, etc., was being linked to be online. Peter's already sent that out, but he's going to send it out again tomorrow for those who haven't got it before. Next month's meeting in Queensland is going to be a site visit to the Adventure Flights hangar at Archerfield. We'll be able to see Spitfire Mark 16, Mustang P-51D, an Aero L-39 Albatross, and other aircraft out there. We had intended to do that meeting a year ago, however, it's going to be on now. This will be a hybrid Zoom meeting, as was pioneered by our Victorian colleagues a few weeks ago, a couple of nights ago, I should say, from Melbourne. So we'll see how that works. Remember that meeting at Archerfield and the associated Zoom meeting will be starting at 6:30 p.m. instead of the usual 7:30. This is particularly because the guys out there, including Brad Bishop, who has it, will have worked all day and are staying open late for us. So we're going to start to do it at 6:30 in a few weeks' time, month's time. We're expecting to restart ordinary regular meetings at Archerfield Terminal Building in June and intend to Zoom these meetings for the out-of-town members. For June, our scheduled speaker is Elizabeth Elscombe-Smith, who was a flight stewardess, as she calls it, in BOAC back in the Boeing 707 days. In July, Mary Garden will tell us about the flying life of her father. And in future months, we expect to have Ross Parker talking about Wirraways and Kim Rolf Smith on operating warbirds. Some sad news today. A Sea Fury had an engine failure and crashed near Yeovilton in England today. As you can see, the airframe looks very badly smashed. However, I'm glad to see that both pilots did survive, and it's all fairly new news, and there'll be a lot more out by tomorrow, I suppose, and things like Facebook, etc. You notice that long canopy on that one. Sea Fury single-seaters had a very short blown canopy, and I've modified that particularly. They did do some 2-seat trainer Sea Furies. The back cockpit on them looked awfully ugly, really, because it was propped on to get up higher, so the a pilot in the rear seat had a fair view of where they were going. Now I'll hand back to Peter, and we'll go into that meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Warwick. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker tonight is Mark Clayton. Mark has held curatorial and conservation positions with the National Library of Australia, the Australian War Memorial, the Powerhouse Museum, and Museum Victoria. He has also been the director of several regional art, social history and technology museums in New Zealand, and he's also been tied up with the Australian Naval Aviation Museum. Mark was working as the General Manager of Recreational Aviation Australia before joining the Queensland Museum Social History team in mid-2014. As an expert examiner and aircraft valuer since 1983 for the Commonwealth Government's National Cultural Heritage Committee, Mark has also served since 2017 as a member of the Papua New Guinea National Museum and Art Gallery's Expert Military History Advisory Group. In July 2019, Mark commenced full-time doctoral studies, examining the justifications and impacts of Air Force reconversion in Australia and the United States during and immediately following the Second World War. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest speaker tonight, Mark Clayton. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm quite surprised to see the number of people here on a Friday night. For those who tuned in tonight hoping to hear about combat operations or aircraft, I'm going to disappoint you. It's not too late to bail out and watch Bondi Rescue or the AFL if you feel so inclined. Tonight's talk is based on a paper I wrote last year for the Queensland State Archives. At the end of this talk, I'll put a link up there and you can take a look at that. But it's basically, it's those, some of you are probably familiar. Can you see Barry Rouse 2004 book, Savage Wilderness?
Yep.
Yep, okay. I got the inspiration reading Barry's book. I only read it last year, long after it was written. But in the credits to that book, he mentions, and you get a very strong sense reading it, that it's actually based on police reports, very detailed police reports. And he credits the source to a file called Air Crashes at Queensland State Archives. And being curious, I thought, well, if there's one, there's a good chance there'll be some others. And so I went looking. Tonight's talk, if I have two objectives I want to get across. One is to highlight the richness of those archives. I've just only started to scratch the surface. But the second is to highlight the pitfalls of historical research. And I want to do that by holding up my own published research, namely this story that I published last year. I was immensely proud of it. Press send, got published. And of course, I didn't anticipate it. Straight away, people started pointing out to me some of the obvious errors. And that's what I want to get across tonight. I consider myself a reasonably capable researcher, but in the event, it proved not to be the case. So I went looking in the archives. I couldn't find Barry's file, but what I did find, well, if you type in air crashes, by the way, you'll find one or two files which bear no relationship to World War II crashes. What I did find, though, was a file titled Mount Stralock, Hinchenbook Island, circa December 1942, US aeroplane 123825. Now, I knew, like many of you here, straight away what that was a reference to. I'd visited this particular site a long time before. And just to put the whole story into context, what you should be seeing here, I'll assume you are because I'm not hearing a how,
yeah, it's good.
is the path that this plane, this B-24, was meant to be following up the coast. I see Bob's here tonight, Bob Livingston. He may correct me, but my understanding is that it was flying Brisbane to Townsville and then on up to Iron Range. En route, it got diverted to Rockhampton, where it picked up a number of passengers, stopped at Townsville, took off, and subsequently crashed on the way. You can't see here, and I can't zoom in, but we're talking about a little island that's Hinchenbook Island, that's 20 minutes flight time north of Townsville. And I've pinpointed there Mount Stralock, so you get a sense of spatially what we're talking about here. Some of you may have been to Hinchenbook Island. This lovely photo is not mine. I admit having stolen this from the internet, but it's a great photo. It gives you a sense of what it looks like from the mainland across the Hinchenbook Channel. And what we're looking at here is Mount Stralock, where the events that I'm going to talk about unfolded. It's 3,000, a tad over 3,000 feet. So it's not a big mountain until you start climbing up it. And someone mentioned earlier that they have done that. It's quite a steep ascent, and it's a difficult ascent. Slippery boulders, rainforest all the way until you break out at 2,500 feet. I went up there on the 29th of July, 1978. So do the maths, and that's 43 years ago, I think. I wrote a story about that visit, which you can, if you're interested, I'll put the link at the end of this presentation. I went up there with one other person, and we did all this in one day, which is rather foolish, but we rode up there on a motorbike, hired a boat, and climbed up there for 4 or 5 hours, took some photos, came back and rode back to university, as you did in those days. It was wasn't a difficult thing. Well, it was a difficult thing, but you did foolhardy things. And this is what it looked like then. Now, I understand it's changed quite dramatically since then. Obviously, the larger pieces are still going to be there, but it's been picked over pretty thoroughly. And I'll give you a few pictures downstream, which will just highlight some of the damage that's been done since by souvenir hunters. It wasn't recognisable as a B-24 immediately. Obviously, things like this give you a clue. And so just try and imagine the first people to visit this site, the police and the US Provost marshals who accompanied him back in 1943. They would have seen this sort of stuff, and it wouldn't have been evident to them even that this straight away was a B-24. And in fact, in the first reports, the suggestion is made that it was actually a B-17, a not unreasonable suggestion. This is one of the larger pieces. You'll recognise this as the vertical stabiliser. And what's also worth commenting on here is the rubble. So it's flying along at 340 something kilometres an hour, and it's hit a solid mountain, and there's a lot of this sort of scree, I guess you'd call it, all around this crash site, which is quite steep, I might add, and in amongst it are lots of bits and pieces. There were lots of these around, and there's another piece of fuselage. You get a sense of how precipitous it is at this point. Now, we're in the sunlight here, but 100 metres below you're in rainforest. More bits and pieces. Okay. So I'll take you back now to 27th December 1943. Sorry, the 28th. So it's the day after the aircraft's been found. And we're in Halifax, a tiny community directly opposite Mount Stralock, Hinchenbook Island. And into the police station that day walks Alex Morgan and Ernie Williams, two local Aboriginal men. And they tell the sergeant on duty that they've found an aircraft wreckage, what they believe is an American aircraft. And their story goes that they were at prospecting for gold, as you do, at 2,500 feet on this mountain when they stumbled across this wreckage. On duty that morning, was a 39-year-old sergeant, Sergeant Francis West. So he's no newbie, he's been around the traps. And he takes a statement. And what you're seeing here is a transcript of Sergeant West's conversation with his bosses up in Townsville the next day. So you can read it for yourself here. It pretty much repeats what I've just said. But he concludes by saying, look, to Townsville, I'm going to immediately organise a search party. And by the way, I've notified Wing Commander McFarlane, because at this stage, he doesn't know that this is an RAAF aircraft. He's got a hint that it's an American aircraft, but he hasn't ruled out the possibility that it might also be an RAAF one. So picture this, it's a small town, Halifax. The total population in that area at that time was 600 odd people. So the town itself, some of you might have been there, it's one main street basically. Word would have got round very quickly in a town that size, if in fact the police sergeant wasn't the last person to hear about it, that, hey, young Alex Morgan and his mate Ernie have found this plane. And in fact, that was to prove the case. Everyone but the police knew about this. But it's now, there's a lot of activity. The Americans turn up from the nearest town, which is Ingham. It's, I think it's about 20 kilometres away. I just can't remember. And I've put this slide in here. This is Google Earth, obviously, but this is directly out front of the police station. So you're looking down the main street here and you're looking north, and the arrow points to, on a clear day, what would be Mount Stralock. It's clearly visible. And you've got to be wondering yourself, as the townsfolk would have been at that point in time, how the hell could a plane crash on our doorstep, virtually on our doorstep like this, a big plane, go undetected, all this time. Well, at this point, they don't actually know when it crashed, but from the accounts from Alex and Ernie, they know it was some time ago. But that's exactly what happened. So there's a lot of gossip you can imagine going on in the town. The town's a buzz. The police sergeant is running around trying to organise a boat. He probably commandeered a vessel because he's taken quite a few people, 7 volunteers, as it turns out, along with 2 provos from nearby Ingham. And he has to get all his supplies together as well. There's a lot going on, and this is happening very quickly. It's a matter of hours after he's learned about this. Just to give you a bit further context, this is a 1956, I think it is, maybe it's, oh yeah, June 1956 aerial view. So this is taken 13 years after the plane disappeared. Of the crash zone, it's the southern portion of Hinchenbook Island. Just out of frame to below this is the mainland, Lucinda, just across the way, a little town called Lucinda. And what I want to draw your attention to here, 2 features. The cross, obviously, and I believe I have a pointer here. Yes, I do. The cross identifies the crash site, Mount Stralock. And the other significant feature here is what is known as Waterfall Creek, which crops up in the police reports. So it's the easiest way of getting to Mount Stralock. You come up this creek. From memory, I forget which branch I took. It might have been the right branch, and it peters out a fair way from the mountain. So you have to get out here, work your way through the mangroves, and then start the ascent. This is not an easy thing to do. So this sergeant, has been at work all day. He's heard about this. He's dashed off a note to Townsville. He's assembled a search party, a boat, supplies, and he sets off on this grueling hike. He doesn't wait till the next day. He sets off straight away. And I just want to get rid of the pen here, sorry. Okay. Ernie, by the way, Ernie Ernie for some reason disappears out of the story at this stage, and that's a question that begs to be answered. I don't have the answer myself. But Alex Morgan, he's just returned, having been up the mountain 2 days ago, told his story, and he's now being told, "Hey, listen, we have to go back up there. You're the only guy who knows where this crash is." So you can imagine how he's feeling as well. He did the right thing by reporting the crash, of course, but his job's far from over at this point. Okay, and I've managed somehow here just want to move. Oh, there we go. Okay. So let me just move. So these guys land on the island 4:30 on Tuesday, the 28th. Remember, the plane was found on the 27th. We're only one day ahead at this point. We have 7 volunteers. 2 hours up the mountain, so at 6:30 at night, a violent storm hits them. And I remember going up a similar peak looking for another American plane, Mount Bartle Frere, and a storm hit me in the this was in the mid-80s. And I can tell you, it's a memory that remains with you. It's not only cold, the water just gushes down those hillsides. And I spent the whole night clinging to a mountain, very similar geology to this one. It's not a pleasant thing. So these guys are tired, hungry, and they're wet, but they have no choice. They've decided they're going to get up to this crash site. They wait till the wee hours and they press on. They arrive at the crash site at about mid-morning, 10:30, I think it was, the following morning. The crash is at 2,500 feet and the summit is 5,000 feet. But that last 500 feet is very difficult, and there's nothing above. Well, there is actually scattered wreckage, but there's no substantial wreckage. So they arrive at 2,500 feet, and West spends the next 3 hours combing and describing this site in forensic detail. This guy's talents are wasted, is the impression I came away with. He's a great forensic policeman, but here he is just doing the beat in a small town, rural Queensland, in a small rural Queensland town. But he does a stunning job. He records the the serial numbers in minute detail of, I'm again just trying hard to get rid of something that's blocking my text here, but he records in forensic detail things like parachutes, transmitters, dinghies, carburetors, starter motors, and all the while reading this, as I'm sure the police and the military, when they read it, they must be asking themselves, well, that's great, but that's not a whole lot of use to us. But nonetheless, he does that. But he also transcribes the text of postcards and paybooks, those that at least are still legible. Because remember, this plane's actually burned. So he spends 3 hours doing this, and he not only confines his activities to the impact site, but goes across the ravine to the ridge on the other side, so he can kind of get a sense of what happened here. As I say, his talents are wasted. I'm still wrestling here with this. I've lost my one. Oh, let's try the arrows and see if we can get. There we go. Okay, you will have seen this photo before, probably. This is a photo I took, as I say, back in 1976. But it's unmistakable. It's a B-24, and it's probably at that point the largest piece of wreckage. Well, it was then the largest piece of wreckage to be found. And of course, the thing that stands out at you then as now is the serial number. Now, West, he doesn't appreciate fully the significance of this number. As I say, he's writing down carburetor numbers, parachute numbers, things like that. And this is just another number to him. I'll just read you. This goes to 2,500 words, this report. So it's a lengthy document. But I'll just read you a small section. Inside the body, and I quote here, inside the body of the craft amongst the debris was portion of the base and cranium of the human skull, which was burnt to such an extent which would crumble to pieces. Numerous bones which appeared to be that of human beings, both large and small. There's a lot of spelling mistakes in this, as indeed there are in many of these police reports. Both large and small, badly broken, heaped up in the front of the fuselage. I'm just skipping here. There were no traces of clothing or flesh adhering to any of these things. Remember, this is a policeman who's not unaccustomed to dealing with this kind of thing. No trace of any identification discs, not possible from to estimate how many bodies were in the plane or incinerated, nor from the general observations to estimate how many persons were on board. A search of all the debris inside the body was not possible without taking undue risk, because he goes on to say the bulk of the wreckage was hanging by a single quarter-inch metal cable, and he didn't want to take that risk to go any further. So what will, just before we leave this slide, I'll just digress. And I've read that this number, 123825, has also since been souvenired and disappeared. That was inevitable, it was always going to happen. But here is a section of that particular 2,500 word report, and it's you get a sense of this, just cast your eye, just how detailed it is. I've highlighted there on the part of the wing found on the lower ledge of the rock was painted the number 123825. And reading this on reflection, I dismissed this error when I first read it. I thought, well, sure, he can't be expected to know the difference between a wing and a vertical stabilizer. And I just didn't give it a second thought. And this was the beginning of my undoing, I realise in retrospect, and I'll speak more about this later. But it's a very interesting document. So he finishes, he's got 3 hours up on this site, because remember, they want to get back down the mountain. It took me, and I was very young and fit, took me, I think, 4 hours going down. He would have been carrying presumably a lot more than me at that stage. And there's 7 of them as well, remember. So they want to get back on the boat. Remember, they have to catch the tides as well. So they didn't get to choose their tides. They just went the very next day. They set off down, returned to Halifax, and they get back there shortly after midnight. And this is what amazes me. Instead of having a shower, a meal and going to bed. Sergeant West then proceeds to he gets his typewriter out and starts writing up this report. He spent the rest of that day typing up his 4-page, 2,000-word report. And this compelling document, written in the prescriptive, I write in my article, the prescriptive constabulary idiom of the day, which it is, and indeed many of these are, included several crucial details. And I quote here, on the front portion of the craft was painted red in rough lettering the words Lady Anne with a heart symbol beside it. Heart symbol beside it. On the part of the wing found on the lower ledge, as we noted earlier, was painted the number 123825 in yellow colour, the figures being about 1 foot high by 2 inches. The upper portion of the body and wings was painted a camouflage colour of brown and greenish grey. So you and I know this is enough to identify the plane positively. Sergeant West isn't certain of that at this point in time. But of course, he immediately conveys this information, or he's got the American provos with him. They immediately convey this up to Townsville, and the identification's a simple matter from then. Within hours of receiving this information, Captain Scully turns up. He's from the US American Air Corps. He calls it Halifax Station, and he confirms that what Morgan and Williams have discovered is a B-24 Liberator that had disappeared more than a year ago, the 18th of December 1942, flying from Townsville to Iron Range on Cape York Peninsula. And in this Google Earth grab, you can see where Iron Range is. It's from memory about 600 or 700 kilometres further north. It was thought the plane was thought to have been carrying about 19 US military personnel then. So even at this early stage, they're not certain. They know what plane it is, but they've got to make further inquiries to establish exactly who was on board. All of whom were thought to have perished. Now, West, he's not done at this point. This guy's a terrier. With trademark thoroughness, I write in my story, he goes off and he checks all the meteorological records, which he knows are held at the local post office. And sure enough, he finds out that rain fell at Halifax on the 15th, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th of December, 1942. And that on the 18th of December, the day of this crash, 193 points, so we're talking almost 8 inches, fell that day. And he goes on to say it's quite possible that the mountain was capped with cloud on that day, which of course indeed it was, and that the pilot was unable to see the mountain ahead of him. Now, Allied aircraft were not an uncommon sight at this part of North Queensland at that time. It was heavily trafficked, all these combat planes moving north and coming south as well. And in fact, the very next day, a C-47 crashes in a storm just north of Rockhampton. It's called the Hoosier Traveler. I think from memory, it was the 317th, it might have been, troop carrier group. But on board that plane were 27 people who were all killed. That crash, by the way, is known, I know it as the Canal Creek crash. Locals know it in those terms. The very next month, another B-24 crashes in the vicinity of Hinchenbook Island as well. And I'd see Bob Livingston's here. I take a quote here from Bob's book, Under the Southern Sun. The same day that this plane disappears, the pilot of another B-24 bound for Iron Range, a Lieutenant Everett A. Wood, he also reports having narrowly avoided a mountain while flying blind at 3,000 feet, 20 minutes north of Townsville. Well, you do the maths and get on Google Earth, and you find that this is probably the very same peak that he narrowly avoided. It was subsequently confirmed that there were actually only 12 people on board this particular aircraft. So I'm moving quickly here because I want to get to the main story. So just a bit of context here. When Morgan and Williams find this plane, it's late what did I say, late, it's actually early, it's December 43. It's a year after it's crashed, but when it crashed, the Allies are very much fighting an offensive campaign. They're staging out of Iron Range, striking the Japanese in New Guinea and returning south. A year later, when the plane's found, the war's taken a completely different complexion. Allies are now on the offensive. The 90th Bomb Group has moved further north. I think at that point, they're probably staging out of Darwin. Yes, at the time this plane disappeared, there would have been a search organised, as there was with Barry Ralph's Little Eva up in Dimaggi. They would have deployed whatever resources they could, but it was far more difficult with this particular one because the units moved up ahead. All the transiting aircraft would have been told, no doubt, to keep an eye out for a missing aircraft roughly in this vicinity. But the Americans couldn't devote the same effort that they would otherwise have done had they still been in the region. Exactly why, I'm unsure, but for some reason the US military decide quite unexpectedly that they want to revisit the crash on Hinchenbook Island. And sorry, I should have pointed out what you're looking at here is an image of Iron Range. Apologies, I can't remember the source. I'm usually pretty good at sources. I think I've probably stolen this from your site, Peter, in which case I apologise. But you get a sense here of just how rough Iron Range was. It was, I think this was, it became operational a month or two prior to the crash in December 42. It's a very, very makeshift operation at that point. Fast forward a year, and it's probably improved somewhat. One reason I speculate that the Americans wanted to revisit the crash site is because the B-24 was a state-of-the-art aircraft at that point in time. So it would have had, there would have been things like frequencies, and of course the Norden bomb site was still very much a technological secret, a closely guarded secret at that point. In Barry Ralph's book, which I keep going back to, he spends some time explaining the efforts they went to recover not only the personnel on that crash, presuming some had survived, but that the police, if they found it, were under strict instructions to secure the Norden bomb site. And that may have been an issue here. I can't be certain of that. Anyway, Colonel Tucker and Lieutenant Fry from the security service is how they're termed in the police report. These are US personnel. They decide, they go up to the site, and when they get back to Halifax on the 7th of January 1943, so we're a few days ahead here, they come back with quite disturbing news. They record that the wreckage has already been interfered with by unauthorised persons, and that mail, etc., had been opened and interfered with. A number of wristlet watch bands have been found, indicating the watches themselves had gone. It goes on to say there were no watches. The implications of this tampering were obvious and unsettling, giving rise to the possibility that maybe, as I say, frequencies and technologies like the Norden bomb site may have been compromised. Now, it's evident to us at this distance in time, it was probably evident to them too, that if there was a Norden bomb site, there wouldn't have been too much left of it. But presumably there were other technologies on board this aircraft. Or maybe they were just motivated by the need to recover our dead. That's one of the things that's not addressed in the police report. It could be, I speculate, that maybe Sergeant West deliberately wasn't made privy to why the Americans wanted to go back there. Whichever, he had his own concerns, because the implications of this news are quite obvious to him. If the site's been interfered with, then it's obviously happened on his patch, on his watch, and it's probably locals who have been involved. And the police at that point are very well versed in the requirements of the National Securities Act. So he's got concerns of his own. This is Sergeant West, the local copper. He's recently arrived from Brisbane, and although he's come from the city, he would have been switched on enough to realise that in a small town like this, it's going to be very difficult to keep something like this secret. He may have asked Morgan and Williams, the two people who found the aircraft, to keep their lips sealed, but he knows full well that that's a big ask. This, I remember, would have been the most exciting thing. I'm speculating here, but I think I'm probably right. Most exciting thing ever to have happened in the small town of Halifax, ever, I suspect. So people are going to be talking. There's not much you can do about that. But West, as I say, has got his own problems. The possibility that there's been security breaches, National Security Act breaches, is going to reflect badly on him. So he immediately sets about questioning the local population. He does this discreetly. It's a small town. He probably knows who to start with. There'll be some likely suspects, no doubt, who he had in mind. All the while, I'll point out, he's oblivious to the fact that the township already know about this plane, and by the way, they've already been up and down several times. So he sets out with very good intentions, and it doesn't take him long to find the honest and upright local butcher. This is 61-year-old Gilbert Noble Carr, and he spilled the beans very quickly. He dobs in a local guy. He's been out fishing Gilbert Carr, and he reports that he's seen a local resident named Carlo Buzio rowing a flat-bottomed boat along Waterfall Creek, which I pointed out before, on Hinchenbook Island. And he saw these Buzio on the 5th of January 1943. So sure enough, Sergeant West goes, knocks on Buzio's door, and he initially denies it, of course, and the sergeant says, well, listen, I've got an eyewitness who says otherwise. And the other advantage that the sergeant has here is that Buzio, like a number of people in this town, are what's termed at the time enemy aliens. So Buzio has been imprisoned. He's been imprisoned in Gaythorne in Brisbane, which is an internment camp for enemy aliens. And I'll digress here just to explain, to be an enemy alien, all you had to be, there is actually a definition, which I thought I had here, but basically you had to be 16 years and over and born in a country or born of parents who come from a country which is at war with Britain. So even in pre-war Australia, that included an awful lot of people, particularly people in North Queensland. And these people were rounded up. It's a sad part of our history. They were rounded up and sent to prison camps in Brisbane, and that's exactly what they were. Certainly not in the same league as criminals, but they were looked on with suspicion. And what we're looking at here is actually Buzio's what's it called, a report on prisoner of war. So you can glean an awful lot of biographical detail about these people. I got all this quite easily online, and there's a whole lot more that you can discover. But you get the picture. He's a happily married family man. He's been in the country 20 years by this stage. So, you know, he would have been well and truly settled into the local community. And it doesn't mention it there. No, I can't see it, sorry. Anyway, so he's Sergeant West puts the acid on him, and he quickly confesses that yes, I don't have. I was over there. I didn't have a license, what they call a permit. You have to have a permit to be in a vessel, according to the aliens restriction, fishing vessels and other small crafts order. You have to have a permit to be in a vessel. Buzio didn't have such a thing. And by the way, he admitted under questioning to have visited the crash site and returned with a bunch of souvenirs, including, I thought I had a description there, but basically small things of no great consequence. And when, in his statement, when asked to explain exactly, well, why did you do this? He said, well, look, the others were going to the crashed aircraft on the island, and I thought I'd go too. Well, there's a good reason. I know I should have had the permit, but I did not bother about it, as I thought it would be all right just to go over an island without it. You know, it seems like a not unreasonable sort of situation, but given the circumstances that we've just described, the Americans are really pissed off at this point, and they're concerned about possibly compromises to military technologies. The Sergeant West has to do the right thing about this. Now, despite being in the early 60s, I might add, Carr, the local butcher who spills the beans, he soon after this signs up and joins the local militia. Although he'd lived in Australia for 20 odd years, as I say, he's married to a British woman. Boozio was considered nonetheless to be an enemy alien. He's actually been rounded up and sent out to Alice Springs as part of I think you were given the option, perhaps some here can expand on this, but my understanding is that you could spend your time in a place like Gaythorne, or if you put your hand up for the Alien Labour Corps, you could go and do manual labour wherever the government saw fit. And so Boozio got sent out to Alice Springs, where he was discharged owing to physical unfitness. And a month before these events occur, he's sent back to his hometown of Halifax. And what we're looking at here, I mentioned before Boozio quickly spilled the beans. Well, he coughs up quite quickly and says, well, yes, with me that day were a number of other people, and he implicates 19-year-old apprentice blacksmith Alec Clark, 37-year-old fisherman Domingo Muraliga. These are all Italians. I think Muraliga might be Spaniard, actually. And Giuseppe Sanzurla, all of whom are like him, enemy aliens. So they're all in a difficult space. They've been found out doing breaching national security regulations, and by the way, souveniring, interfering with a wreck at that stage was also a breach of national security regulations. So things are not looking good for them. When questioned, all four admit souveniring from the crash site: ammunition, spoon, camera lens, a piece of parachute harness, small pieces of aluminium, and interestingly, these are fishermen. So one of the stories given was that, well, we wanted the aluminium to make lures. And that's, to me, not an unreasonable sort of an explanation. And of course, they also confessed that they weren't in possession of a permit to be employed on or to be in a fishing boat or other small vessel. Now, it's the Luckless Clerk. He's 19 years old, this young guy. He's the one whose testimony proves the most damning. Because he goes on to say, well, look, I saw Boozio with some American dollar bills. I'm not sure what denomination the notes were, but I think one was a $10 bill. I'm certain this man had the bills as he had them in his hand when he showed them to me. I do not know where he found them, but I think he got them out of the letters, as there was a lot of letters lying about. Also, a lot of Christmas cards. This mail appeared to be tampered with before we visited the scene of the wreckage. So this is bingo moment for Sergeant West. He's got some pretty incriminating evidence here. And worth pointing out here, so this plane crashed just before Christmas. So it would have been loaded with Christmas mail, presumably going north. And Christmas mail then, people did this, they put a few notes in the mail to send it home or to send it up to the troops up north, whichever. The locals wouldn't have known this until they actually visited, but it helps to account why there was so much money floating around at this crash site. Before long, the police were also interviewing a 32-year-old labourer, a local labourer by the name of John Wildzote. Now, poor old Johnny, he goes down to the pub and after consuming a considerable amount of liquor, I quote, is said by several witnesses to have displayed 2 American Treasury notes, which he claims to have collected from the crash site. Wildzote initially denied this, but then when the police point out that, well, listen, we got a bunch of witnesses from down the pub, he actually fesses up and says, well, yeah, I did actually souvenir some Dixies. And then under questioning, he actually confesses, yeah, I did souvenir some Treasury notes. But then he goes on to say, his wife having thrown these into the kitchen stove, immediately the police car pulled up outside the residence. So the evidence isn't there, but the confession's there, and his wife also corroborates this story. Wilder, he does what everyone else before him has done. He dobs in the rest of the people who are in the boat. And so this cycle plays out over again. In fact, over 6 weeks, he dobs in another bunch of people who crossed the channel with him. And reading this, I was thinking, Hollywood couldn't have scripted a more interesting cast of characters. So on board Wilder's boat, people like First World War veteran Thomas Gibbs. So this is not a young guy. There's a local timber hauler called Joseph Meany. And also, interestingly, amongst this lot is 23-year-old army deserter Colin Twaddle. As I say, Hollywood couldn't dreamt up better names here. I doubt Twaddle's accomplices would have known he was an army deserter, but with the advantage of hindsight and the internet, it didn't take long to figure that out. Having survived the trenches of Western France, 46-year-old Gibbs, who's Meany's deckhand, he clambers over the wreck, and of course he severely injures himself. He lacerates his ankle and wrist, and so he has to be helped back down the mountain when they eventually descend. Now, when initially interviewed, Gibbs and Meany denied having interfered with any of the mail or retrieved any of the souvenirs. However, police when they go and visit the boat on which they're living, he's seen that Gibbs is seen to be tossing a hessian bag into the local river. I think it is the Herbert River up that way. And when this bag is retrieved, which it is by police, it's found to contain, sure enough, a leather wallet. So things are looking even less promising for this lot. Colin Twaddle was unable to, the police report goes on to say Colin Twaddle was unable to be interviewed as he could not be located. This is the deserter. I've been informed by a person on the approach of the police that on the approach of police, he slipped overboard from the boat into the water and swam underwater to a bank and secreted himself in the mangroves. The following morning, January the 9th, he was seen leaving town by bicycle. And what happened eventually to Twaddle, he was charged with desertion and court-martialed on 27th of June 1945. So the law did eventually catch up with him. Now, the full extent of the security regulation breaches are now becoming quite apparent to the local police investigating all this. And the investigations carry on throughout January for 6 weeks, as I say. Others caught up in this include a local farmer, Hermit Morley, and his son, Herbert Blake Morley, his visiting nephew, who's working for the US Army, by the way, up in Townsville. He's 17 years old. Well, he's just visiting the rallies, and he gets caught up. None of these people have permission to be either on the mountain or in a boat at that point in time, because they don't have the permit. Having discovered and reported the crash, the only guy who's looking good out of all this is, of course, the Alex Morgan, the 40-something Aboriginal who found this crash. He's the only one who hasn't got dirt on his hands. He's the only one who doesn't loot the plane or interfere with the mail. Instead, he souvenirs a rusted, this is his undoing, he souvenirs a rusted 45 caliber pistol, which was almost certainly inoperative. Consider it's flown into a solid mountain at 347 k's. It's been incinerated and it's been lying in the open for a year. But nonetheless, he did what probably you or I would do and picked up this pistol. When the police come knocking on his door, and I'll just digress here, throughout these police reports, the other locals are all described quite unambiguously. They're described by name, and that's about all. In fact, because I've had the advantage of the internet, I've discovered a number of these locals are also known to the law, as was Alex Morgan. He'd spent, the Aboriginal, he'd spent some time in the lockhouse, but only the Aboriginal players in this drama are described as people known to police. The racism is quite unsubtle throughout these police reports. The police knock on his door and they find this cache of goodies, one gold wedding ring. I'll just move quickly here because I want to get to other stuff. One gold wedding ring, one gold watch, one silver case, 2 surgical scissors. On it goes. So you can read the report more fully, but 2 American water canteens, he picks up some practical stuff too. Then there's money, there's $quarter-dollar coins, dimes, nickels, pennies, 1 colonel's badge of rank, 1 second lieutenant's nickel rank, 1 screwdriver, 1 pair of khaki shorts bearing the name Kipple, who in fact was one of the servicemen killed on this. You can see you can guess what the police were thinking. They think, bingo, we got him here. He'll almost certainly have some money as well. Morgan, of course, denies this. He said, no, listen, I was allowed to take these. The police, and they asked him, who said you could? And he said, well, the Americans who I took up the mountain. Police go and corroborate, check this out, and sure enough, the Americans corroborate this story. So Morgan's looking quite good. As I say, he's the only one who comes out with any dignity out of this whole episode. The police did actually look at charging all these other guys, these other players I mentioned, who were found with money and valuables in their possessions. For some reason, those charges are all dropped. Instead, Morgan is the only one who's charged. He's charged criminally in the local Court of Petty Sessions on 28th of January. They get 2 local JPs, a teacher, and I forget who the other one was. And he's, as I say, charged criminally and fined £7 for being in possession of a 45 caliber pistol and 7 rounds of ammunition, the property of the United States government. The Americans, the Australians, wouldn't have found out about this had Morgan not done the right thing. I'm sorry to labour this point, but it's one of those injustices that just screams at me. And it's one of the purposes that I felt I had to write this story, just to get it off my chest. I get wound up about these things sometimes. But here's a guy who also solved one of the greatest, what was then one of the greatest aerial mysteries in Queensland. He also solved that, but unless you read my story, you would never know this. So after 6 weeks of continual questioning, imagine this small town, they're just run ragged, neighbours dobbing in neighbours. There'll be long-standing friendships severed, I expect. There'll be deep-seated mistrust. They've had 6 weeks of this, and they finally think, right, we got a criminal conviction, it's all behind us. And so it was, or so it appeared. But then 15 years later, some other locals go up the mountain. And this time it's a local resident by the, I forget what his profession is, Dewey, no, I forget his, anyway, in 1959, Barry Hatkinson's, that's his name, he's a spare parts dealer. He goes up the mountain and he finds a ring, I think it was, inscribed with the name Dewey Hooper. The following, he goes down and rings the police. And this is, rings the Air Force in Townsville and tells them about this. Next day, another local rings up and says, hey, by the way, I've been up there and I've found a human jawbone. So the case is reopened. The Air Force immediately, by this stage, the recovery team in Hawaii has been formed. Well, in fact, it was formed long before that. They sent out a team to Townsville, and in the file, it's quite interesting. They give them a $20,000 open check, but they fly out here and they go up the mountain and do their business, and indeed they find quite a few more personal effects and human remains. But while they're in country, they also hear about this police file, and they do what you or I would do. They ask the police, "Hey, listen, we've been made aware that in 1944, you guys undertook intense investigations into this matter. Can we have a look at that file? It might help our understanding of the events." They put that request in good time. the answer arrives the day before their plane is to return to the States. And basically it comes from the police commissioner, who formally denies the request on the grounds of departmental policy. And I'm speculating here, but my guess is the police commissioner didn't want this open, least of all by the Americans, because it reflects pretty poorly on the police at that stage. The police, Queensland Police, were the last people to hear about this, and all this looting, this desecration of graves, this lying, all took place on their watch. And by the way, there's a lot of racial injustice peppered through this reporting as well. It's not a good look from any angle. And I suspect that's the reason why the police commissioner denied access to it. But of course, in denying access, he's just guaranteed that someone like me, or it wasn't me, someone else would come along sometime and think, hey, this is a fascinating story that needs to be retold, which is indeed what happened. Okay, so let's just jump ahead here. At the same time, this recovery team comes over, or thereabouts, a local guy, and I don't have his name to hand, I'm sorry, a local farmer, he goes up the mountain and he finds this panel called, with the name Texas Terror written on it. And many of you here will know that this is the name that has now been attached to this aircraft. And I began by saying that the thing I wanted to get across most from this talk is not the events that are described in the police file. You can read those at your leisure anytime. But really the perils of doing historical search, and by historical research, I mean not just using primary source material, secondary source, but also primary source material. So I said earlier, I consider myself a reasonably capable researcher, but this was probably my first mistake. And I'll sum these up at the end. When I saw this, like others, I thought, great, there's the name of the plane that crashed on Hinchenbook Island. If I'd paused for a moment, I would have also seen that, hey, listen, those rivet holes can't be more than an inch apart, and therefore that name can't be more than 2 inches high. That can't possibly be the name of the aircraft. But I didn't join those dots then or until very recently, I must confess. I just uncritically accepted everything that I'd read and everything that I'd heard. And I'll take you back to mid-1970s, because at that stage I was in contact with he was I forget which faith he was, might have been a Jesuit priest in Halifax, who took an intense interest in this crash. He's the one who erected the memorials there, and he'd acquired all the local knowledge on this plane to that point. And when he told me it was the Texas Terror, I just accepted that uncritically. But as I say, that was not correct. What we're looking at here, I just threw this in just to help people understand what we're talking about. If you look on the nose of this plane, just below the nose, you'll see a name. I think it's I hear you knocking. You can't see the last word fully. But Bob Livingston, who's here tonight, he described this to me as a station name. He'll correct me if that's the case, but it's a good name. It says it's self-evident, and it describes what I'm talking about. And if you look closely at planes of this era, they often had station names at gun positions, typically. And what Texas Terror very likely was a station name. If you're a local farmer who's hacked this off the plane in the 1950s and doesn't know a hell of a lot about planes, you probably think you found a plane called Texas Terror. Easy enough error to make. One that's probably less forgivable if you've studied the subject a bit like myself. But indeed, that's exactly what happened. And if you have a look, this is I think a third bomb group, B-25, out at Charters Towers. But just to further illustrate the point, I can't fully read the name here, but you can see another station name here below the top turret, and another down by the waist gun there, I suspect, as well. So you get the idea. we're talking here not about the name of the plane, but about the station name. Now, what happens when you put a bit of research out in the public domain, like I did last year, is that as soon as it gets published, someone rings you up and says, "Hey, by the way, were you aware that I've got a photo of the name Lady Anne?" And indeed, that's what happened in this instance. Now, I knew about this Lady Anne, but I'd never seen a photo of it. I'd only read what Sergeant West said in his report. And you recall he said, on the side of the fuselage, written in red, was the name Lady Anne. To me, that was a eureka moment. I've identified this plane correctly after all these decades. And so I called my talk. I think I called it the Lady Anne or some variation of that. Only after I published this story did Bob and a couple of other people point out the error of my ways, but more particularly, the family that still have this piece, they got to read my story somehow. A guy, one of the family lives in Singapore, and somehow one of his relatives in Ingham, nearby, sent his brother in Singapore this story, and he sent me some better quality photos of this piece with, by the way, the part number on the back. And the part number on the back, like all consolidated liberator part numbers, begins 32F508-14. Armed with that part number, it's irrefutable proof that this name was attached to not the fuselage, but the tail gun. And by the way, if you look at the size of it, this piece we're looking at here is 30 centimetres long and maybe 10 centimetres high. It can't possibly have been the name of the aircraft either. So what we're looking at here is another one of these cruise station names. There's no one, I think, would argue that point now. And an aircraft that size could typically have quite a few of these crew name stations. So there's my second mistake. I uncritically accepted Sergeant West's description of a name on a fuselage and went with that. I should have known better. I mentioned earlier that that this story had spread around the local community in Ingham. And when, I can't think of his name, the farmer came back with this, the first piece called Texas Terror, and then he told Brian Carr, he told Brian Carr's dad how to get up to the wreck, and he came back with Lady Anne. And they, whether it happened then or sometime later, I'm not sure, but someone had the good sense to write to America and say, hey, listen, can you tell us more about this plane? And somehow advice came back from the University of Memphis, which is where the archives of the 90th Bomb Group is. They're there because the historian of the 90th Bomb Group deposited his research there. And amongst his research was a whole bunch of diary entries. And in amongst those diary entries was this particular one we're looking at here. This is an extract from a 90th Bomb Group crew member, a diary of Clay Holiday. Remember, this wasn't available to me when I wrote my story. This is just late last year or earlier this year, I became aware of this. Clay Holiday, dated 27th of January 1943, and basically he's saying that, hey, listen, they've found Lieutenant Gumar's plane, just 90 miles north of Townsville. And he adds this observation: the plane hadn't burned and someone had robbed the bodies. I've never seen such a bunch of lowdown in all my lives. I wish I'd had that quote. It's probably a great quote to use either in a story or certainly as a title of a story. But basically the Clay's expressing his disgust at the Australians, and in particular the citizens of Halifax for looting and desecrating war graves and carrying on as they did and lying. And you read this, and as the citizens of Ingham did years later, and it confirms in their mind that, hey, this plane was actually found as early as January 1943, not 1944, as the police report would suggest. And this gives rise to a whole bunch of local stories. Brian Carr writes to me from Singapore, and he just lists some of these stories, and I'll just skip over them because they're all part of what I'm trying to get across here. I'm being very long-winded here, but I'm trying to communicate the perils of doing historical research. If you go to Ingham today, some of the stories you'll come across, and this is sent to me recently, based on this Clay Holiday diary entry, where they still believe to this day that that the plane did crash much earlier than the police reports suggested here. They believe up there that it was found much earlier. The wife of one of the people even mentions in an article, having read my article, it triggered her memory, and she remembers she relocated to Boona during the war. And so she goes on to say that they heard a plane circling overhead the day before the crash during a storm. They thought it crashed. The next day, they could see something glinting on the mountain at Hinchenbook. So there we have another version. It takes a day earlier than it actually occurred. A friend of my father's, this is Brian Carr in Singapore saying this, a friend of my father's has the same story, saying a lot of residents had heard the plane. A fisherman friend of his father's was at the Halifax police station renewing his fisherman's licence in December 43, when an Aboriginal guy comes in and reports that he's found a plane on Mount Strala. The police officer never even raised his head to acknowledge him and blew it off as nothing new, suggesting again that they'd known about this for a long time. It's thought there was a different sergeant, this is Brian Carr talking here, it's thought there was a different sergeant at the police station that day, and that it was officially reported as being found. Sorry, I'm probably totally confused there. Anyway, you get the idea. There's this body of wisdom accumulated in Halifax, which holds fast to the view that this plane was known about well before the police report was written in 1944. And as happens with a lot of these crashes, and I've recently written a story about another one up in Cardwell, very same thing happened. You get these apocryphal stories emerging, and typically they include, well, there was a woman on the plane, did you know about that? And the evidence for this seems to rest on the fact that, well, my father remembers seeing a pelvic bone at the site, and it appeared to be that of a woman. Now, there's forensic proof. There was a woman's red shoe seen at the site. And then it goes on to say, another local guy found some dog tags recently, and these were returned to her family in the US. The family was upset as they'd been, the dog tags of a woman, I should say. The family was upset as they'd been told she'd died elsewhere in the Pacific. So there's all these apocryphal stories emerge, and long experience has taught me, as doubtless many here, that you'll never dislodge these stories. No amount of forensic evidence will dissuade locals from believing these things. Just finally, a few other stories that emerged from this. The Americans searched the plane wreckage for an international clock. This is a new one, as it was thought it would hold information such as the time of the impact. Well, it very probably would if there had been an international clock. And of course, you can't have a mystery crash site without it being loaded with valuables. And one of the stories that persists to this day is that some guy collected a large sum of cash from the site. He was a half-caste Aboriginal. This kind of rings suggests Alex Morgan, who quickly packed up and relocated to Sydney, where he purchased a block of flats. So the stories just get, that's what I find one of the most interesting and amusing things about historical research too, is that some of these stories just get better with each passing year and each retelling. So just to sum up on the police report and my story, the thing that I'm ending with this slide, and I'm sorry to harp on about injustices, but it's one of the themes that is dear to me in this, particularly in this instance. And I begin my public story by referencing Bernard O'Reilly. I'm sure a lot of you remember Bernard O'Reilly. If you're old enough like me, you probably had to read his book at school in Queensland. He's the dairy farmer who in 1937 found the missing Stinson in the Lamington, what we now know as the Lamington National Park. He set out when everyone else couldn't find the aircraft and found it. And on board the Stinson, I think were half a dozen or 7 people. And he became a national hero. So much so that there were books written about him. There still are numerous books, articles. There was even a television mini-series. And of course, if you go down to, I think this is Boona or Bow Desert, there's now a statue celebrating this guy's achievement. Well, just 7 years after Bernard O'Reilly found this missing Stinson airliner, our man Alex Morgan finds a plane that's been missing for a year. And by the way, it's got 12 people on board. It's the greatest unsolved Queensland aerial mystery to that point in time. But who the hell has ever heard of Alex Morgan? You won't find any statues about Alex Morgan anywhere. You won't find anything written about Alex Morgan other than what I've written and what you're hearing here tonight. I hope that in time is redressed. It's not a big story, but it's a small correction that may just help correct the historical record and deliver some justice as well. I end with this slide here. One of the things about being black in Australia at that point of time is that you're pretty well invisible. So I went looking, as you would, for a photo of Alex Morgan. He's the key player in all of this. He just doesn't exist. So you can find a fair few references about him being deported back to Palm Island, where lots of First Nation peoples were sent at that time. You'll find, if you peruse the Halifax Watch House records, you'll find numerous references to him, as you will indeed a lot of those other European protagonists in this story I mentioned earlier. This is the only photo of either of them I've been able to find. I find it quite a sad photo, a picture of Ernie Williams taken in 1970, and here he is making tourist souvenirs at the Cherbourg Mission. He would have been not a young man at this point in time. A story like this throws up as many questions as it answers. And it also helps you tell a more accurate picture about what wartime, Australia wartime was like, particularly on the home front. We don't hear a lot of stories about the home front. Last week, when everyone gathered around the memorial in Halifax, I'm sure this kind of story, even if it had been known, probably wouldn't have been given any oxygen, because it doesn't sit well with the dominant narrative. You know, the story we like to hear, the story we often hear is that in wartime Australia back then, we were all doing the right thing and helping the war effort, when in fact, this one little file reveals quite a different story, one of looting, lying, war grave desecration, all motivated by self-interest, I might add too. But it also throws up a number of questions, and these, I'm not surprised, aren't answered by the police report. The police report is very illuminating, but it doesn't, things that are obvious. For example, why didn't they get a statement from Ernie Williams? He's mentioned in the opening paragraph as being there on the day, finding the plane, and then he just disappears. I just don't get it. Why weren't Morgan and Williams, the two Aborigines who found the plane, why weren't they charged with national security breaches? Or why weren't they questioned? Do you have a permit to be on a boat? Do you have a permit to be on the island? None of these obvious things are kind of addressed by the same person who can record parachute numbers and starter motor numbers. How did Morgan and Williams get to the island? And the one that just screams at me is, why were they prospecting for gold at 3,000 feet on an island during wartime? Anyway, they're just some of the ones. One idea that also intrigues me, and I'm just probably throwing fuel on the fire here, but if you look at a Google Earth of this area, you'll see that Palm Island is visible from Hinchenbook Island. It's 40 k's to the southeast. Its peak would have been quite clearly visible. Now, we know it was stormy that particular day, but it's just possible, in my mind, it's just possible that someone standing on Palm Island at that point in time just happened to see a big flash on the summit of Hinchenbook Island at that time. I have no evidence for this, but it just might help explain why Morgan and Williams were on Hinchenbook Island in December 1943 at 3,000 feet. Now, I will end after this. I want to sum up some of the mistakes I've made, and I'm bearing my soul here because I want others to learn from these errors. Mistake number one, I uncritically accepted the claim that Hinchenbook B-24 was named Texas Terror when all the evidence suggested otherwise, with the advantage of hindsight. I uncritically accepted my friend Barry Ralph's source citation saying air crashes, a file called Air Crashes in the Queensland State Archives. I spent a lot of time wasted trying to find that file. I uncritically accepted Sergeant Reed's description that the name on the side of the fuselage was Lady Anne. Granted, that's a reasonable mistake, but I should have, I now know, treated a police constable's report with not more circumspection. I should have looked at the evidence more critically. And I uncritically accepted all published accounts that this aircraft was newly arrived from the States. And I have Bob Livingston to thank for this. I've read the 9F bomb group history, and it says this plane had arrived from the States, as do many sites that you visit. And what as people interested in history, you would have seen this yourself. You see something on one side or in one book, it's simply transcribed or reparaphrased and packaged and put in print elsewhere. And simply by the act of repeating it, it becomes a self-fulfilling truth. When in fact, as a historian, I should know better. I should have challenged that thinking and said, no, that's maybe it didn't arrive straight from the States. Certainly the time frame suggested that. It arrived some months before or weeks before, I think. But in that time, it had actually done three missions. Two of those were bombing raids, and one was a search, I think, a search for this aircraft. And the last mistake I confess to is not challenging Memphis University's transcription of Clay Holliday's January 1943 diary entry. I just took that as gospel. The fact that it's typewritten should have sounded alarm bells for me when in fact it didn't. Out of curiosity, in recent months, I wrote to Memphis University and said, hey, can you go back and just check that handwritten entry, particularly the date, and just check for me what it was. I didn't load the question and say, here's what I think it is. I just said, can you check it? And sure enough, they came back and confirmed for me that in fact, the entry in the original was dated 27th of January 1944, not 1943. In transcribing it in type form, someone unintentionally had got the year wrong. And because of that, to this day, everyone up in England believes that the plane was found long before it actually was. And as I say, nothing's going to shift that belief, I suspect. So there you go. I've bared my soul and probably put everyone asleep. And I'm happy to answer any questions if people so have. Help me here, Pete, how to get out of...
Righto. Many thanks, Mark, for bearing your soul and for your very interesting presentation. Can you just stop your share?
There we go.
Can I add, when you're ready, I'd like to add a little bit of context.
Please.
Is that okay, Peter?
Yeah, I was going to say something, but where you go.
Okay. You've got to remember that these guys were straight out of the US. They know about Australia. And particularly right now, we're talking to a whole bunch of guys who know about what's going up in far north Queensland. When you drive up north there, you come to the end of the mountain range that runs all up around Queensland. And to be able to get north, you have to do a hard right turn, and you immediately, north of Townsville, you're pointing straight at Hinchenbook, and you go round the corner, around the bottom of the mountain range, and then you're in Halifax. So very few of the people probably on the end of this Zoom message have even been up that way, and I have quite often. I've never been up. I would never attempt to climb Mount Stralock. That it's one of the things that wasn't mentioned is it's full of a thing called lawyer vine, and it's got hooks in it that face the wrong way, and they're very nasty things, and you don't want to get caught in that. The point is that these fellas had only been in Australia for about a month, maybe 6 weeks tops. They have come out of southern USA. They know nothing about this part of the world, and they are thrown into a place that even now you and I wouldn't be very comfortable in. This was gouged out of the jungle, and it was a horrendous place to be in, with high rainfall, heaps of mud. They'd had horrendous losses in crashes, accidents, and the aircraft, the B-24, at the time was considered to be a death trap. Some of the people who were officers within the 90th Bomb Group were eventually removed because they were so anti-B-24. They were all for the B-17. It really was a very, very poor time. And the way to get from Brisbane there with no maps was keep Australia on your left, which, let's face it, is a pretty reasonable way to do it. You've got to get up to the tip of Cape York, and you turn a little bit right and you go to Port Moresby. So these guys have got no idea about terrain. They've never seen anything. They're happy. They're off. They've been flying over water for hours on end, heading north from Brisbane to Townsville, and then they repeat the exercise to go further, and they're sitting at 3,000 feet over the ocean. Now that's a pretty, that's a fairly safe sort of altitude to be flying at, and they would not have known anything. They would not have even had time, I think, for their retinas to recognise the fact that a piece of cloud had suddenly become a piece of mountain, and they just slammed straight into it. So it was all very quick for them. They would have known absolutely nothing about it. I think you really have to take into account the fact that these people were really operating on a shoestring, no idea of what was going on at that particular point in time. We're talking about December 1942. It was only 1941, a year before, when America even entered the war, and they were the first. These guys were the first ones to get to that part of the world. So, I really think that you should take into account that, the dice were loaded against them all the way. That's all.
Yeah, a lot of the early Americans were using shell road maps for their navigation. Mark, I've done some research at State Archives, and I did manage to find 2 very large files of police reports. There's the two numbers for the files, A64579, blah, blah, blah. And one of them's got 528 pages, which I photographed, and the other one's got 189 pages. I've renamed some of these files, but in amongst all of that, I don't believe this particular aircraft is listed. So there must be some other crash files that I wasn't able to find, but I spent quite a few hours photographing nearly 700 odd pages of those 2 files.
You've just confirmed what I mentioned earlier. You put yourself out there and someone comes along and says, hey, were you aware of this? I appreciate that, Peter. I did as I keep saying, I spent some time in the archives myself, having no luck. So I flicked the problem to the archive staff, who went away and came back and also said, no, we don't have a file called air crash. I see you do have the Dumadji one in here. I thought I saw it in here.
What, this one on the mountain?
Yeah, did I see Little Eva mentioned? Yeah, Little Eva, there we go.
Yeah, I've got Little Eva.
Yeah, okay, so the archives staff couldn't find that. I couldn't find that. But
quite a lot of pages, as you can see, on Little Eva.
Yeah. I'll get you just to, if not now, but later, just email me. A lot of these others I did find.
Yeah,
so
right. Yeah, that's the other one.
I wonder, actually, a lot of these files I recognise and I have been able to access, but they're not listed under a single file called. I'm thinking out loud here that maybe archives might have separated these.
These were in one big file.
How long ago was that, Pete?
Let me see if there's a date. Hang on.
Like it wasn't in the past year, or?
No, it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I'm thinking that archives might have separated and renamed these.
I doubt it. The other thing I'll just show people so they get a better sense for these station names. That's what that other photo was cropped from. So that's Peter Johnston's Toes, who lives in New Zealand, and that's the Lady Anne bit that. And you can see, if by looking at the ruler, the letters are probably just over about 1 1/4 inches high.
Yeah.
Yep. So, any other questions, everyone?
Well, look, thanks for your interest.
Darryl wants to say something, but he's still muted.
Who's that?
I tried to unmute, but I got shaky hands. Yeah, I was interested in your Queensland Archive search as well, and I took on board what Peter said there, and I've noted down some of those file references. But I've been looking on and off for data about a Lincoln crash on Mount Superbus.
Not Superbus.
No, not Superbus. That's that's my South Australian background. I kept calling it Superbus.
I've been up to that.
And it's one of these things that I'm a little bit like yourself, Mark. I'm not really interested in why this aeroplane crashed. It's well documented, and I've got the accident report and all the issues behind that. But what intrigued me was that the crash, the aircraft passed overhead of a bunch of Brisbane bushwalkers on an Easter Saturday morning and crashed on Mount Superbus. And the efforts that group of people put into finding the crash site, trying to find survivors, nobody survived. And my question, and I can't find this on RAF files certainly, was were those people ever recognised, publicly thanked? They were in the middle of the circumstances and they did the right thing. But I would love to find out more. So I'm going to now head off to State Archives and see if I can find anything from the Warwick police records that might have their side of the story as well.
Yeah. Peter might like to jump in here. I've never looked for a file on that site, but I have read that club's report in recent times. I hadn't had the same thought as you. These people need to be recognised. But what I have time and again when I read those sort of reports is, I only do this now, is, there's sure to have been a police involvement and a police correspondence file. And you will probably find that in archives, yes. It's sometimes knowing which jurisdiction to turn to. They aren't always self-evident. You mentioned Warwick. when you said that, I first thought, well, no, I wouldn't have instinctively thought Warwick. I would have thought somewhere more down. What's the town near there?
Oh yeah, there was. I've had another report that it was. I'm just looking up the area. More south than that.
That's Downey, is it? Or?
No.
Yes, somewhere like that. I'd be thinking. Yeah.
Killarney or something.
Yeah, Killarney. Yeah.
But the bushwalkers themselves said that they called the Warwick police. So.
Okay.
And the person who claimed Killarney was just somebody on Facebook.
Yeah.
So yeah, I haven't gone there. That's what I'm just saying. I'm going to go now and see if I can find any sort of police records for that accident and the rescue afterwards. I've got they talk, the bushwalkers themselves mention the name of the policeman who arrived at the site. So I've got a reference there as well. So
Yeah.
just his last name. No, thank you for that. You've inspired me to go in another direction.
Yeah, well, you're nearby. It's particularly relevant to your centre, of course.
Yeah, we've got bits and pieces there, and we've got a memorial in our memorial gardens, those sorts of things. So yeah, we've got a little corner in the Heritage Centre, and all I was doing was refreshing it, I thought, until I read the story myself, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's not even a mention of that in our original display.
Oh, yeah, and it should be. You're right, yeah. Yeah, well, good luck with that. I look forward to that Zoom session.
Oh no, not another one.
Yeah, that's another talk.
Okay. I hope.
Oh, Peter, I'd like to speak when I can.
Yeah, well, hang on. I think you wanted to say something first. You, Barlow?
Yeah, that like on Hinchenbook Island there, the people of the Herbert district, like Ingham and all that, they erected a monument up there, and you can see that from the road as long as it's a clear day. But
really? Okay.
Yeah, it's like a cross, and it's pointing towards the mainland.
That's the thanks for that. That's that was erected by that. I remember now. He's a Franciscan priest.
Yeah.
Cassius, Father Cassius was his name. A very interested and I always found it odd that a person of the cloth would take such a deep interest in aviation historical research, but he did some very thorough research and he organised that memorial cross, which is just above the impact site.
Yeah.
So you have to be particularly keen to go that extra 100 yards to get up there. Yeah, that's interesting. You can see it from the mainland, yeah.
Yeah, as long as it's a good clear day, it stands right out. But the Ingham SC rescue people took him over there to erect it.
Oh, okay.
Back in the 1970s, because I was there at the time.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Yeah, because my job was, in those days, we were shifting from wartime communications to modern stuff in the 1950s and 60s. And my position was to sit between the two pilots and the Herc and fly all around those islands and one and at 150 feet down the channel to check all our communications from Townsville.
And you got paid for that?
My
own.
Good job.
Thanks, Hugh.
Righto, Roger.
Peter, firstly, I'd like to thank Mark. Very interesting cover, particularly the archival search background. In my exercise on the Iron Range section in Queensland Airfields, I had fairly little to draw from, but I did have access to a small writing that a friend of mine had done prior to that, and of course can't verify where he got his information, but I quote from it, and that is that he understood the first evidence, if you like, or mention of finding the aircraft stemmed from, and his words were, a couple of Aboriginals who were picked up by anyway, apparently your mention there, Mark, of looking for gold up feet above sea level. Don't sit with what my friend had published at the time.
Okay.
The suggestion that he made was that somebody would be looking for stream tin on the slopes of Hinchenbook Island. Anyway, the point was that he went on to mention the people on board the aircraft at the time. And I'll quote that very carefully. Most senior of them was Carroll C. Riggs, a West Pointer commanding the 197th Coastal Artillery. He had held the appointment since 26 June when the regiment had been deployed for anti-aircraft defence around Perth, Western Australia. The regiment was now fulfilling the same function in Townsville, but batteries B and E had been deployed to Iron Range. Colonel Rigg was paying his first visit to his detachments. Accompanying him were Lieutenant Raymond Dakin, also of the 197th, carrying money for the gunners who had not received any pay since their detachment in August. And then he goes on, Captain Peter E. Ripple and Carl Silber were both members of the 8th Fighter Group stationed in New Guinea, and a Lieutenant E. Cooper, who was on attachment to the 19th Bomb Squadron, 22nd Bomb Group at Iron Range, and so on. The point there is that money being the root of all evil, there is this mention from this fellow's searching at that time, and I'm talking about around about the early 90s. At least he gathered the names and ranks of the people on board, including this Lieutenant Raymond Dakin, and the inference that he was carrying, I quote again, Dakin, who was carrying a, what is it, paying his vest, accompanying Dakin, carrying money for the gunners who'd not received any pay since their detachment in August. So again, there was this suggestion of there being some money on the aircraft for a pay. I'll leave it.
Yeah. Look, that could help answer a few why there was intense interest, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And look, it's not. It sounds quite reasonable. The challenge, of course, is, and it shouldn't be difficult, is, if you had access to the right Air Force resources in the archival resources, you just might get lucky and be able to confirm something like that. But what this sort of exercise teaches me is and unless you can triangulate the truth somehow, you can find a single reference which might lend some weight to it, but unless you can find corroborating references, you treat these things with a bit of caution. It's an interesting possibility, and hopefully one day someone will follow up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
One of the people killed on that, as Roger just said, was Captain Carl Silber. I went over to San Diego for work many years ago, stayed on the island there, and I met up with his son, Carl Silber Jr., and he was showing me information on his father and photographs, and he was showing me these photos, and opened one page, and there's a photo of my wife's cousin, Pat Kenny. Pat Kenny in Townsville, who Hugh Barlow probably knows. And Pat why Pat was in the photo album was that he had given to Carl Silver Jr. his father's dog tag that had been recovered from the top of Mount Strala.
Oh, what a lovely poetic ending. Yeah.
Yeah, just a funny little moment.
Yeah.
While I was over there in San Diego.
A very, very interesting tale. Yeah. And probably with a crash site that size, and because it is comparatively difficult to access, they'll be finding bits for years and years, I suspect.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Any other questions, anyone? We might call it quits, I think. It's getting on to 9:15. So
Thank you all for your interest
okay.
and your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Hello.